Of the many things that you can do with a bandsaw, one of the most useful is resawing, taking thick boards and turning them into thin ones. I'm going to show you a few hacks to help you resaw effortlessly and accurately. And then, as an added bonus, take a single block of wood and, with just one resawing setup, turn that into an elegant set of nesting boxes. Ow. For most bandsaw operations, you cut through the thickness with the board resting on its face. But for resawing, you cut through the width with the board resting on its edge. Now, there are just 3 steps to doing this well. Choose the right blade, adjust it to the right tension, and properly position the fence in relation to the blade. Sounds simple enough, but as you probably guessed, there's a lot of information to be considered for each step. For most resawing operations, craftsmen use the widest blade available that will fit their saw. For this saw, I'm going to use a 1/2-inch blade, that's 13 millimeters wide. I'm also going to use a skip tooth blade, just 3 or 4 teeth per inch. These actually cut faster than a regular blade with 10 to 14 teeth per inch. The reason for this is the more teeth you pack on a blade, the smaller the gullets become, the spaces between the teeth. When sawing thick stock or resawing wide stock, the gullets can become packed with sawdust. This keeps the teeth from reaching the wood. A skip tooth blade clears the sawdust more efficiently, so it cuts faster and burns less. But you might also consider a hook tooth blade. Some skip tooth blades have hook tooth profiles. When you feed the wood into a blade, if you feed it too fast, the pressure will bow the blade backwards, stretching the back edge and compressing the leading edge. Let's pretend this strip of paper is a bandsaw blade. Watch what happens when I shift it to the right, stretching the back edge. The leading edge bows. If this were actually running, that leading edge would flip back and forth like this. This, in turn, would create a pronounced washboard effect on the surface of the wood. Hook teeth draw the blade forward, counteracting the feed pressure. Providing you're feeding at the correct speed, you can get a smoother cut and a faster feed rate. Finally, you can get a smoother cut with blades that have a variable pitch, constantly changing tooth sizes and spacing. These are still classified as skip tooth or hook tooth, but by varying the pitch, they substantially reduce the vibration and you get a smoother cut for it. Bandsaws have a gauge to help you tension the blade, but you shouldn't rely on just that. These are calibrated for ordinary carbon steel blades, and other blades such as bimetal blades may require more tension. So, tension the blade as the manufacturer recommends. Then, if you are unsure of whether or not the blade is at the right tension, do this. Make sure the blade is tracking properly in the middle of the upper wheel. If not, adjust the tracking. Raise the upper blade guide as high as it will go. Back off the thrust bearings and the guide blocks. Neither the bearing or the block should be touching the saw blade when you turn the wheel by hand. If you do this next part without the cover like most folks, take great caution. But if you feel uneasy, like I do, replace the cover, if just for a bit. Start the saw and watch the blade. If it's not vibrating or fluttering from side to side between the blade guides, that's good. If you see it flutter, like this, it's too loose. Add some tension until it stops fluttering, and then add some more. How much more? Well, that depends on the saw and the blade. I found that when you have a small saw and a substantial blade like I have here, it can be quite a bit more. When this is the case, I rely on my finger, and I add tension until I can move the blade sideways no more than 1/8 inch, 3 millimeters. With modest pressure. The real tension test comes later on when you actually begin resawing. If the blade begins cupping in the wood, increase the tension a little at a time until the cupping stops. After tensioning, reposition the thrust bearings and the guide blocks. Start with the inside upper and lower guide blocks and place them so they just touch the blade. Make absolutely certain that they don't push the blade to one side. Wrap a dollar bill or a piece of paper around the blade and bring the outside guide blocks in so they just touch the paper. Adjust the blade guides so they are even with the bottom of the blade gullet. And then revolve the wheels by hands to make sure that the blade weld passes through the guide blocks easily. If it sticks, remove the blade and lightly work down the weld with a small sharpening stone. While it is possible to scribe a line down the edge of a board and to follow that as you resaw, you'll get much better results if you use a fence to guide the wood. The fence, however, must be properly positioned in 3 different ways. First, it must be parallel to the blade lead. Blades rarely cut parallel to the flat. They usually pull to one side or the other. This is called blade lead. To find the lead, draw a straight line on a thick board and begin cutting freehand, following the line as best you can. When you're tracking the line without constantly having to readjust the wood, stop cutting. Hold the wood securely on the saw table and trace a line with a felt marker along one edge on the bandsaw table. This will become the lead line for that particular blade. Whenever you position the fence, it must be parallel to the lead line. By the way, some folks like to adjust the blade lead by adjusting the tracking. You can do this, but I don't recommend it. We're already working with a pretty wide blade, and we want it to stay in the center of the wheel to protect the teeth and the wheel. The fence should also be parallel to the blade vertically so it cuts the wood to the same thickness all across the width of the board. There's a quick way to check for this. Take a wide board and hold it firmly against the fence. Make a shallow cut, no more than the width of the blade. Turn the saw off, turn the board around, and check that the back edge of the blade fits into the cut easily. If it does, the fence is vertically parallel to the blade. If it isn't, you have 2 choices. You can shim the fence so the fence is parallel to the blade and perpendicular to the table, or you can tilt the table so the fence is parallel to the blade and try to remember to tilt it back when you're done resawing. Since none of us remember squat, I recommend that you shim the fence. Finally, you can use this same test to position the fence to cut the thickness you need. Just measure the distance between the edge of the board and the edge of the cut. If it isn't where you want it, you can move the fence closer to or farther away from the blade. And unless you have another reason, I strongly suggest that you resaw the stock slightly thicker than you actually want. That will give you some extra wood to sand or plane. Now that we're all set up for some precision resawing, let's get back to those nesting boxes that I showed you earlier. The first step, of course, is to prepare the stock, and this can be as simple as squaring a piece of firewood, which is how this box started out. It was a small walnut crotch that my neighbor gave to me. I figured there was some interesting grain in there, so I kept it around for a few years until it was good and dry. However, before you cut any stock, get to know your bandsaw a little better. And by that, I mean actually measure the capacity. This machine is a 6-inch saw, but it measures a smidge smaller. I had to cut the stock for the nesting boxes so the thickness and the width were 5 7/8 inches, or about 150 millimeters. You can also glue up the stock from smaller pieces, as we did for this set of nesting boxes. But if you do this, remember, all the grain of all the pieces must run in the same direction. When you're working with a solid block of wood, you really don't have to worry about this. The grain direction in this little box that we made as a test piece actually runs diagonally through the assembly. When gluing up stock, you must remember that the wood expands and contracts across the grain. So, you must align all the pieces to move in the same direction. If you don't, the box will eventually crack and split. How do you get them aligned in this crisscrossed ribbon pattern? Well, that also takes some resawing. The stock for the right and the left portions of the box are glued up normally, with the grain running through the length. The outer portions of the box are made from cherry, while the ribbons are made up of white oak, walnut, and maple. You can, of course, use any wood species that looks good to you. Making the ribbon for the middle of the box is where this gets tricky. Although this ribbon appears to cross perpendicular to the other, the grain of both ribbons is parallel. To make this middle ribbon, cut 1 inch or 25 millimeter wide strips from the ends of oak, walnut, and maple boards so that the grain runs across the width of the strips. Glue up the strips to make a 1 inch or 25 millimeter thick block with the grain running through the thickness. Let the glue cure, then resaw the oak and walnut blocks to make 4 blocks, 2 from oak and 2 from walnut, just a little thicker than 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Resaw the maple block so that it is just a little thicker than 3/4 inch or 19 millimeters. Using a disc sander or a belt sander, sand the faces of the blocks to remove the saw marks. Or, if you don't have a sander that will leave the wood reasonably flat, adhere a piece of 60 grit sandpaper to a flat surface and sand by hand. This should take the blocks down to 1/4 inch and 3/4 inch, or 6 millimeters and 19 millimeters respectively. Finally, glue the blocks together to make the middle ribbon. Because you're gluing end grain, and end grain tends to wick up the glue, apply some extra. The large block you glued up, cherry on the outside, ribbon in the middle, saw this in half across the grain. Then sand the sawn ends flat. Glue up the 3 blocks, right side, middle ribbon, left side, to make the cross ribbon stock you'll be working with. When the glue is cured, true up the surfaces on a jointer or a sander, making them all square to one another. From this point on, making the box is a simple matter of cutting all the parts in the right order and then gluing them up in the right order. Resaw the top and the bottom of the box. Then resaw the front and the back. Resaw the ends. Finally, resaw a plug from the same surface where you cut the top. This plug, when glued to the underside of the top, will position the top on the box. And this is what we had left over. Now, as you resaw each of these parts, carefully mark them so you can get them back together in exactly the same position from which you cut them. Also, give some serious thought into how thick you're going to make each part. If you make them too thin, they may warp badly as you cut them, so badly that you won't be able to reassemble them. This is especially true when you're working with a solid block. The walnut crotch that I cut up was just full of reaction wood. My first resawn parts were just 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters thick, and you can see what happened. But when I readjusted to resaw at 3/8 inch or 10 millimeters, the parts became a lot more stable. Sand, scrape, or plane all the inside surfaces of the box parts flat, removing the saw marks. Smooth both the top and bottom surfaces of the plug, as well as the right and left surfaces of the ends where they join the sides. However, be extra careful not to take too much stock from these end surfaces. Glue up the ends to their sides to make L-shaped assemblies. As you go, wash away the glue squeeze out. Then glue each pair of L's together to make a box. As you go through these glue ups, constantly check that the sides and the ends are square to one another. An assembly table helps a great deal in this regard. If you'd like to see how to build the one that I'm using, check out our assembly table video. True up the bottom edges of the box on a sander or on sandpaper stuck to a flat surface. Then glue the box to the bottom. Check, double check, and check again to make sure that the wood grain on all the parts is properly aligned. Also glue the plug to the underside of the top. When I do this, I rub 2 pieces of 50 grit sandpaper together over the adjoining surface to get a little grit in the wet glue. This helps keep the pieces aligned. They are less prone to shift when you tighten the clamps. When you've assembled the box, fit the top to it. Because you've sanded the adjoining surfaces of the ends and the sides, the top, or specifically the top with the plug attached to the bottom, is likely to be a little tight. Sand down the top edges of the ends and the sides so they are flush and perfectly flat. Then shave down the edges of the plug with a small shoulder plane or a scraper until the lid fits snug but not too tight. Plane, scrape, or sand the sides, top, and bottom to make them all flush and smooth. Now, so far, I've showed you how to do this with a sander or with sandpaper. But there is another way, and it doesn't kick up as much sawdust, and it's actually a little bit faster. All you need is a sharp, well-tuned plane and a scraper. Put the lid in the box and clamp the box in a vise with one side up. Plane the surfaces flush with the smoothing plane. Then take a few extra swipes to remove most of the bandsaw marks. Finish up with a scraper to remove all the marks and create a smooth surface. Do the same thing to the other side, then the top, then the bottom. Your hand plane should be set to a very shallow cut to do this, and don't take too many swipes. This technique requires a little practice, but you'll get the neck pretty quick. At this point, you've removed all the identifying marks on the sides, top, and bottom of your box. And these lids only fit and line up one way. To get the lid back where you want it, take an awl and make an indentation in one corner of the box. Then make a matching indentation in a corner of the lid. Do the ends last. Because of the way in which the box is made, the top may shift a little to the right and the left. Line up the wood grain and then tape the top to the box to keep the top from shifting during this last operation. I prefer using a sander or sandpaper for smoothing the ends. Too much danger of tear out or chipping when you're planing or scraping end grain. Afterwards, it's the same procedure over and over again for each of these boxes. Leave the tape on while you finish sand the ends. Then remove the tape and finish sand the side, top, and bottom. Do all of this with the tops installed in the boxes. Apply a finish inside and out. I finished this set with several coats of wipe-on tung oil. I let the finish cure for a couple of days, and then I burnished it with brown paper, which is a very mild abrasive. This gives the finish a very soft feel, which is important with boxes, because these are going to be handled more than almost any other project you could make. The folks you give them to will want to nest them and unnest them again and again. And by the way, the smallest box is a great place to store the scrap you have left over. That way you won't have to feel guilty about throwing it away. And yes, I did sand and finish the scrap. This assuages my dominant pack rat gene. It's also a lot of fun watching people try to open it. No one would believe that a woodworker would be that diabolical. If you'd like the plans and detailed instructions for making these nesting boxes, they are available from the Workshop Companion General Store. You'll also find my book on using the bandsaw there if you'd like to know more about this incredible tool. And as always, thank you for your kind attention.